Bloomburrow has introduced a lot of hype around a few powerhouse creatures, and looking at these cards I can really see the appeal at first glance. Whenever these cards are being played, they kinda just swing the game in your favor by a long shot. Jaeger making every creature a food token, and Maha making all of your opponent's creatures go down to just 1 toughness, these cards pack a punch. But I think that the hype around these chase cards is overshadowing some other commanders that, if you pull them in a Bloomburrow pack, could offer a much more unique play experience. Starting off is Mabel here to Cragflame. Mabel gives other mice +1/+1 and off entering creates a legendary equipment token, Cragflame. Now Cragflame gives +1/+1 vigilance, trample, and haste to whatever it's equipped to. Now Mabel is a card that works great with a Valiant mechanic from Bloomburrow that is mostly put on mice. Now Valiant can be simplified to whenever this creature is targeted for the first time by a spell or ability each turn, you gain a buff or positive effect. Now Mabel works so well because on entering, Cragflame is an equipment which can target all of those creatures with Valiant instantly. Now this leads to our game plan. Now our Mabel deck is going to have a lot of those mice with Valiant from Bloomburrow on it, and the key to success is getting value from those triggers each and every turn. Now since Mabel creates an equipment card off entering, I think that a equipment mice deck is probably the most optimal way to build around her. Now Mask of Memory I think is a great equipment for this deck. Since we're in Boros, white and red don't really have a lot of card draw, so this would be able to help us a lot by making up for what our colors aren't good at. Another good equipment for this deck would be Bloodforged Battle Axe, which is a great way to get multiple equipment onto the battlefield and suit up our mice for combat. Now that we have our equipment and some of our mice in the deck, it's important for me to clarify that this is not like most equipment decks. Now this deck does not want you to cast Mask of Memory, equip it to Emberheart Challenger, and then keep it on there for the rest of the game. This deck's main goal is for each turn be able to move our equipment from mice to mice, triggering every Valiant trigger and getting the most value out of them. Now the biggest problem in this deck's game plan is that moving equipment from creature to creature each turn takes a lot of mana. After 2 or 3 creatures, we're probably out of mana for our turn and not able to cast anything from our hand. So we need to be able to get around that problem. 2 great cards to do this is Puresteel Paladin and Forge Anew. These both instantly get around the mana cost problem, letting us move our equipment around the board for free. Now Fighter Class is another card that I strongly recommend going into this deck. Off entering, you can tutor up any equipment card, and if you move to the 2nd level, you reduce the equip cost of your equipment by 2, making most of our equipment free to move around the board. Now I would also run some equipment that have no cost to equip, like Lightning Greaves, and also a card like Brass Squire is a good way to cheat 1 equipment cost per turn. Now I like both of these options because it gives us way to move our equipment around the board without using mana. Now another great creature for this deck is Nahiri Forged of Fury, which is a card I really like in this deck, getting a nice impulse draw effect that, if we're lucky, we can cheat a equipment card into play for free. Now Bureau Headmaster is a card that gives great value to our equipment deck by reducing the casting cost and equip cost of our equipment by 1. Now some more generic value cards, I like Cassandra Eaglebearer and Wyless Soul of Steel, which are great card draw options that synergize really well with our equipment theme. Now I also like Astor Bearer of Blades since he has a semi-tutor effect off entering and reduces the cost of equip down to 1, which is great value for us. Ivor Battle Ready is another nice group slug option based off of how many equipment we control, which can really speed up games. Also, Open Up the Armory and Steel Shaper's Gifts are 2 great equipment tutor cards that really aren't that expensive to buy. Now for some more expensive options, I see that a lot of the swords of X and Y work great with this deck. Most of their abilities give us a lot of value for what we're trying to do, and since their equip costs are only 2, a lot of our equip reducers make them free to equip. Now I see the card Sagrada's Aid as a great value to this deck, but I really don't think that you need a lot of these expensive cards to make this deck fun and powerful. Now I think a fun way to win with this deck would be a Voltron strategy with Mabel. Maybe whenever you're done equipping all of your Valiant mice with all those equipment, you just put them all onto Mabel and swing in for a big attack. Or I could also see just a mass equipment theme and just suiting up a lot of your mice and swinging in for big damage. Now I think either one of these ways to win is really viable with Mabel, so if you end up pulling her from a pack, I think it's probably worth it if you're looking into making a equipment deck to maybe build one around her. Now our next commander is going to be Kastral the Windcrested. Kastral has whenever you deal combat damage with a bird, you can put a bird card from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield with a finality counter on it, put a +1/+1 counter on every bird you control, or draw the card. Now I really like Kastral because its ability is useful in all stages of the game. No matter if we're behind, ahead, and stasis with our opponents, getting able to cheat in a bird from our hand or graveyard is always great. Now adding a +1/+1 counter to our birds is a nice little win more effect, but also having card draw stabled on our commander is really nice in all stages of the game. Now to really get Kastral's ability, we probably need to be making a bird tribal deck that centers around combat damage. Now Warden of Evil's Isle and Watcher of the Spheres are really nice cost reducers for most, if not all, of our creatures in our deck, since almost all of our birds are going to have flying. Now since we're going to be swinging with a lot of our birds, Heir, the Windlord, is an amazing card that gives all of our birds vigilance, and with its cost reduction ability, it also works great with Kastral, since if we deal combat damage with a bird, we can then choose to draw a card, which will then make our spells 2 less to cast. A Myriad Angel is a card that I really think is going to help us go wide with bird tokens, making our board big and upping our chances of being able to deal combat damage to a player. Now if we do plan on going wide with birds, Skycat's Sovereign is a great card to add, being able to bulk up rather quickly with all the birds we're going to have on the field. Now Shabrez the Sky Shark is also a creature that can get big with all of our card draw off of Kastral's ability, and I really like Sinu Keen-Eye Protector's Scry ability in this deck. Now since we can Scry too, this goes great with Kastral's draw ability like before, since we can move the cards that we want to the top or bottom, and once it's exiled, since we're in a combat deck, Sinu is almost always going to be able to come back into play. Now, if you're in a pod that doesn't have a whole lot of flying creatures, a very toxic card to add would be Magus of the Moat. That way you shut down all of your opponent's creature decks. Now, if your pod does have a lot of flying creatures in it, cards like Brotherhood Regalia are really nice to make sure that you're always getting Kastral's combat damage trigger. Now, a card that I think would be a lot of fun in this deck is Helm of the Host. While it's not really synergistic, I think that getting to have multiple copies of Kastral would be a really fun interaction that your opponents would have to answer. Now just remember, this card is a bit expensive, and it isn't really needed for this deck to function. I just find it as a fun interaction that you could have with Kastral. Now I see this as a really nice deck that you can kind of throw any of the birds in this color identity in and have a good time. Kastral's ability does everything you want a commander to do. It cheats in spells, buffs up your creatures, and draws cards. You can just pump your deck full of all the birds you want and make sure that you consistently get in combat damage, and Kastral as a deck is gonna go off. Now if you end up pulling Kastral, if you think having a bird deck would be fun, I think you should definitely think about building around it. Now the last commander of the day is Wildsear Scouring Maw. Now this bad boy gives all of our enchantment spells that we cast from our hand Cascade. So our game plan is to just go big or go home. Now since a lot of our creatures and enchantments in this deck are going to have a higher mana value for Cascade, making sure that we ramp enough is key to getting going early. Now Dryad of the Isolin Grove, Fertile Ground, and Bigger on the Inside are all cards that help us ramp, but also play into our enchantment theme perfectly. Now Sanctum Weaver can really push us ahead mana-wise, being able to just add mana based off the number of enchantments we control in this deck is going to be huge. And Bear Umbra is a card that I really like, having a sort of Feast and Famine effect that just plays right into our enchantment theme. Now that we have our ramp down, another key to this deck is making sure that we have enchantment creatures, that way we can get Cascade not only off of our base enchantments, but off of our creature spells too. Now one of those enchantment creatures I'd like is Xenagos, God of Revels, which really helps us pump up our other creatures. Now one of those creatures that I'd like to pump up is Nyxborn Behemoth, which is a card that just screams value in our deck, being able to not only get a 10/10 enchantment creature with trample, but also being able to reduce its mana cost based off of our other enchantments is fantastic. Now Nihilus' Colossus is another card that just packs a punch, being able to double one of our creatures' power and toughness. Now Nyxborn Ancient is an expensive card that can just push us ahead of our opponents super quickly with the triple mana production. Now some all-around value cards that really synergize with this deck, starting with Faldorn Drenworld Herald. Since Cascade is technically casting a spell from exile, every time we Cascade, Faldorn will trigger, letting us make a 2/2 wolf. Archetype of Aggression is a great card that gives our big creatures trample, which allows us to get in for combat damage even if our opponents go wide. Now Fanatic of Ronus is a great mana dork that will almost always tap for 4 green mana, since our commander Wildsear is a 6/6 and most of our other creatures will be. Now lastly for value, Enchantress's Presence, Eldolian of Blossoms, and Viridian Enchantress are all great cards that help us get a good amount of card draw while synergizing with our deck. Now Wildsear is truly a fun commander that gives Gruul the Cascade mechanic in a really fun new way through enchantments. Now I just say ramp hard and swing harder. Wildsear is a fantastic commander for anyone wanting to play a stompy creature deck that also dives into some enchantments and enchantment creatures. Now I hope that out of the 3 commanders I listed today, that if you pulled one of them out of a pack, you might be interested in making a deck out of them. I think that the chase cards of Bloomburrow are fantastic for making a commander deck out of, but I think that the hype around them has definitely overshadowed some of the smaller creatures in the set that are really fun to build a deck around. Now if you enjoyed the content, I'd love if you subscribe, but until next time, have a good one.